Hi, I'm going to show you how to cut out a recess by hand for a typical hinge. We're going to use a piece of scrap wood. I'm going to mark it up and I'll show you how we cut it out. There's a number of ways of doing this. There's the textbook way, which will be in another video because you want slightly different tools, but you mightn't always have them. And then there's the way that you would typically do on site. It's a little faster. We'll go through both. So being in a workshop, it's not exactly like being on site. But if you've never done this before, this is a great place to be able to practice how to cut out a recess for a hinge. We're going to make use of the bench and vices and other equipment, which you wouldn't have on site. But it gives you good practice for doing recesses. And this is where we'll start with it. Once you master this, then you'll be able to do it on a door and do it on site. So we've got our hinge, our combination square, and a piece of timber. To find the depth, how far in this hinge should go, we don't just push it up to the barrel. If you pushed it up to the barrel on a door, it'll eventually squeak. So this piece here, it's only this bit of metal that we measure, and that's called a flange, that piece of metal. So we take our combination square and we'll use it as a depth stop and we'll run it right up to the edge there. That's not going up to the barrel. There is a slight gap, and then we lock that in place. That's how far in you're going to mark for your hinge. So that's going to run along there. We're not worried about the length of it yet. And when you take your hinge and you can mark the length of that. So that's going to go between there and there. We'll square that across. And then how deep are we going to cut that recess? Well, a nice easy way to find that out is with our combination square. If we lay it on something flat, we can take that and loosen it. Pop it down there and check the depth of it. That's it there. That's the depth of our hinge. So now we'll take this and we will mark up across there the depth of our hinge. We're going to cut this out. We can pause there because I'm going to show you another way. That's using a combination square. If we take another piece of timber, and if this was the side of the door, if you don't have your combination square, but you've got a couple of other tools, what we do is we'll take our hinge and square it up along the barrel, and when we push the other flange down the other side, the other wing, we will then pull the hinge out a fraction. So if you look very closely in here, that flange is now, this piece of metal is now in line with the edge there, and there's a slight gap. And when that's fixed in place like that, you can then mark out your hinge. That's going to get cut out. To run the depth, and you will want a combination square, or you'll have a second hinge. And with the second hinge, you'll run it flat along there and you'll be able to mark the bottom of that line. So in this case, I'll scrap out of timber and I'll put it up to that and I'll run the bottom of that line along there. And that's how we'll mark the bottom of our timber. You don't always have combination square. Let's put that out. So this recess is for practicing to do this and not actually doing it on the door just yet. So we're marking out our waist. This is going to get cut out. With that, we don't typically cut it in the vise. This is practice for cutting out other recesses on our carpentry or joinery. And we've got our bench, so let's make use of it. And we've got clamps. Let's make use of those. So with that, I'm going to clamp it onto the bench right on there. If I clamp this onto the bench, when I start hitting this timber, any of the pressure that's going into that is not going to move down in the vise. If I have something in the vise and I bit it, that's actually just going to move down in there. Typically, it will move in the vise. That shifts. So the energy that you're putting into this isn't used efficiently. So we put it on near the edge over a leg. So when you put the force into this, all the force will go into cutting the timber. When you use a clamp, it doesn't go this way. If you're busy looking at your work, you're going to poke your eye out. Certainly when these are quite tall. So clamps go that way. It seems like it's upside down, but that's the safer way to do it. Not going to poke an eye out with that. So that's secure on there. To run this, we're going to use a wider chisel than the actual hinge. We're going to use a wider chisel than the hinge. So we'll hang on there for a second. To do this, we're going to take a wider chisel than the actual hinge. So we can take one pass at this instead of multiple passes. I'm going to hold the chisel by the neck with my thumb and finger. I can maneuver that. My other hand has got the mallet. So both hands are behind that blade. I'm going to start with the back of the blade about 3 mil away from that line. Because when I put my timber on that, when I put my chisel on that timber, if I drive it in that bevel is going to push the blade backwards. So I want to start a little off because I can clean it up at the end. So that's a couple of mil away from the end there. And when I'm looking at this one, that can actually be a little away from that line too, because we can clean that up afterwards. So we're going to take our chisel and put it at a 90-degree line on the end one. Couple of taps into that and we won't go below that line. Turn your chisel 90 degrees on this end. Couple of taps into that one, that'll knock it down. Now we want to start taking this lot out, this recess. I'll put a small line along here and work in towards that one, and that will cut our fibers in pairs. When we start working our way down here, I'm going to start from the far end and work towards me, and I'm going to tilt my chisel, no longer at 90, less than 90, about 15 less. So what do we got there? 75, 70 degrees. And I'm going to knock this so the bevel will drive that timber out that way. I'm going to do it every 2 to 3 mil. Now, this seems like a long process, 2 to 3 mil all the way down. It's actually pretty fast when you get to it regularly. We're just literally going to walk that chisel back, walk it back, couple of heavy taps. All the time, you're going to be standing straight over this and watching that go down into that timber. How hard you hit this, you end up having to calculate that. With practice, some of your timbers will be harder than others. And you can see with every tap, that's driving the timber back that way. It definitely seems like a long way, and you'd be tempted to make it 5 mil or more. But when you come to the next stage in the cleaning out, I can actually take a little longer. This is pretty rapid as you get through it. You'd want a sharp chisel for this. So check out the link on how to sharpen chisels. We're done with that. For the demo, I've only used scrap. I should have actually used longer timber. So with that, you can take your mallet, peel out that timber, or your hammer. That's a lot of that gone. You can leave it in there if it's well clamped. I use a short piece of timber. But I'm going to secure this in my vise. And if you've watched the first video on using it, the very first lesson on using a chisel, to see that elbow on the bench, hold the chisel by the neck. Now this is secure in here, and I've got both hands behind that blade. Not like this. So many students, first week, they'll cut themselves thinking that they have to hold their timber. You don't. It's held in the vise, hands behind the blade, always. When that's in there, now we'll take our chisel and have the back down here, and you can start to work towards your line down there and cut that out, and we'll drive this chisel through those cuts. And that goes in. Very tempting to put your fingers in there and run that out. Don't. Take it out with the chisel, blow that out, that goes in there. And then at this point, I hold my chisel flat on this. I have an angle on it. This is at a slight angle, so we can pull that down here and cut those fibers right in at that end. Now, we've got most of it out, but we're still left with a small line around the side, and that's where we'll start to clean this up now. Get our chisel to our lines. You can see how that drives down, so it's better when it's flat. This one, we will get my head out of the way, drive that down, take that edge out. And we'll cut on the waist side of that line, leaving the line there, as we'll be able to take a little more out, as it's easier to take it out than it is to put in. I don't want to rush this. So when you're starting out, this takes a bit of time and practice. So we've notched that one, curve that in there, peels out, control that cutting in there. Hands, both hands. I can't stress that enough. I don't like blood, especially my own. You won't. Hold you up, hands behind the chisel, use the chisel to clean those bits out. How this looks at the moment isn't all that important if you see these lines in here, because you're going to cover it with a hinge. If you do want to take it out, you'll be able to use additional tools and work on that afterwards. This is a beginning introduction. We've got that out. We'll put our hinge in there, and we've got a flush hinge to that timber. You've cut your hinge and you've cut a recess. Let us know in the comments how that works for you. Hope that helps. See you in the next one.